Having with us Mr. Phil Pearlstein. Here is for you, Mr. Phil Pearlstein.
At last I feel tall. I want to thank everybody involved in putting on the exhibition, especially my old, I can't call her a student, Mary Baldar, who worked in my studio when she was I think a junior in college on an apprenticeship program, probably around 1975, and we had some great times together, especially on a trip to Philadelphia where I painted a portrait of Cardinal Kroll, and Mary came along to help me set things up. And we've been in touch ever since. And I also want to thank Ricardo Vieira for doing such a terrific job on this. And I thought I'd just give a brief survey of my career as an artist. So I'll start with the slides.
Would you like to control them, or would you like me to advance?
I was looking for the control.
Here.
Okay. Well, my career started at a very early age in Pittsburgh, in high school there, and we had a terrific high school art teacher whose name was Joseph Fitzpatrick, and at least 10 other people in that class. He had an after-school program, an art club, and as I say, at least 10 others that I'm aware of went on to have careers in the art world later on. And a few years after I was in his classes, he had Andy Warhol as a student. Well, it was right when National Scholastic High School art contest started up, and he sent works that we did in that afternoon art club to the what do we call it? To the well, that year the National Scholastic High School exhibition was going to be at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and so it being local, he encouraged us all to send in works. And two of my paintings won first prizes. One an oil painting, one in oils, that's the carousel at the top, and then a watercolor painting, which is the painting of the Black Barber Shop. And the show traveled to the Metropolitan Museum in New York that year, which was 1941. And I was in the 11th grade, and suddenly appeared Life magazine, which was a great cultural force at the time. These two paintings were reproduced in full color at a time when color reproductions of artworks were still relatively rare. And so at the end of my junior year in high school, I became a local hero. Not too long after, I was in the United States Army, drafted along with everybody else in my age group. And after an initial training in the infantry in Alabama, was put into a workshop in Florida where we did training aids, visual aids for how infantry weapons were to be taken care of, and how they worked, and so forth. And then after that, idyllic period lasted about 6 months. I was sent overseas to be an infantry casualty replacement. And this is, I kept making drawings during all this, drawings and watercolors. And this drawing was started, I had this little sketchbook with me. It was started on the spot, and then I would probably noodle it up in the evening. But this was during a lunch break with these little kids staring at us while we were eating. And we used our those metal helmets to sit on. They were great things. You used it as a wash basin, and it was your main bit of comfort. Well, this is the kind of thing I had worked on in Florida. It's like a big dish towel. You spread it out and you took your rifle apart and you put the actual parts on the silhouetted shape. So you could learn the numbers, learn the names. I drafted everything there. It's one of my first masterworks. And this is a more typical kind of thing we did, how to read a compass. The actual chart is about 4 feet high, and we did everything. I worked with these men who had been commercial artists, and they taught me lettering, perspective, layout, and then we made stencils for the silk screen printing and actually did the printing. So it was a thorough education of a kind. Well, after I came out of the Army 3 years later, I went back to Carnegie Institute of Technology, Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh, and I became, because of my experience in the Army, I was made the art director of the Carnegie Technical, which was the magazine of the engineering school. And I'm showing this slide because it's so much like the cover of the New York Times magazine last weekend that showed somebody's brain activities being measured by wires. And that's exactly what this is about. Measuring somebody's mental activities. But I find it interesting in terms of the style in which it's done. It's so intellectualized and combines everything I knew about early 20th century art at that point. It's Italian futurism combined with Italian futurism combined with French cubism, and probably a lot of Russian poster art that came later. I also went to work with the design professor at Carnegie, and worked with him for the 3 years I was there, assisting him. He hired 3 of us to assist him on doing a series of folders for architectural products of the Aluminum Corporation of America. He did the layouts, we did everything else. The lettering, by the way, is done by hand. I mean, the original. And I did that little painting that shows the cross sections of extruded aluminum shapes for that, which would then become that sewer lid. But I began using those shapes in paintings in the painting class, and the big hulking figure were cross sections of extruded aluminum shapes for window frames, and I saw it as this hulking monster. The other two elements were taken from lock mechanisms, and that became a self-portrait of me screaming, but it seems to be plugged into the back wall. That was done in my senior year. Well, as a portfolio to take to New York City to show around to art directors, I decided that maybe there really was a future for visual aids in education. And I spent a lot of time, I decided to illustrate the origins of the United States Constitution. And there are a whole bunch of them, which all had to do with the origins, the arguments that went into setting up various aspects of the Constitution. This had to do with the Electoral College. I can't believe I did it now. At any rate, I showed, that was my portfolio, part of my portfolio. And as soon as I hit New York, and I had a series of names of art directors at different agencies and magazines and so forth. It was easy to make appointments, and they saw everybody who telephoned then. I don't know if they still do that. But the reaction was disastrous. Every one of them looked at this stuff and said, "What are you, a communist?" They just took the political look of it at face value, and that would be the end of the meeting. I'd be shown to the door. So I went back to the rooming house, and I made a new set of illustrations, which had to, again, God knows what I was thinking of. But I took a story from a book that had just recently been published by a psychiatrist who worked with the New York City Police Department. And I decided to make charts on the story of this one woman who one day went home and chopped up her children and set them on. She set them on fire first, and then she chopped them up. And I came up with this diagram with the two kids dangling from the strokes of the dollar sign. That got me nowhere. But I began painting again. And that's based on that chart. The dollar sign dominates. And of course, it's very expressionistic. I think I was reinventing 19th century symbolism all over again for myself. And I got a job working with a man who was really a very brilliant graphic designer. His name was Ladislav Sutnar. And I worked with him for the next almost 8 years. And during the course of our relationship, he even more or less suggested that I go back and study art history in a graduate school. I still had time left on the GI Bill. But he was an extraordinarily interesting, very sophisticated man who had been involved with the Bauhaus people in Germany and had started up his own version of the Bauhaus as Minister for the Arts in Czechoslovakia before World War II broke out. And then he had come to America to disassemble the Czechoslovakian pavilion that he had designed and to sell off the materials once the Germans took over Czechoslovakia. Of course, he stayed on in America and became the head designer for an organization called Sweets Catalogs. And I worked on a couple of his accounts, mostly for American Standard sanitary equipment. And this is a typical page from that one of those publications. This had to do with shower units for institutions. He would suggest the overall style, and then the three of us who were his assistants had to work out all the details of all the material that went onto the different pages, and then he would play around with it and make it look brilliant. And then we'd go back and do all the mechanicals and so forth, paste-ups. But we drafted everything by hand. Even those ruled lines were done by hand. Of course, you used photostats, which was new then. That was the advanced technology of the day, photostat, for the multiple uses. But the original lines were done by hand. Anyway, I took some of those shapes and used them in paintings. Here's one of those shower units. And he's attacking a young girl who started off as an ink blot on my drafting table. And he's attacking her. This was before Hitchcock got the idea. And I went on to do things like this, Superman. This was done in 1949, 1950. And the time when I started studying art history. But I decided that, well, I could use anything as a subject of a painting, get rid of the subject matter, and then the audience would go on to admire the way I applied the paint. I did a series of these, including the Statue of Liberty, the American Eagle, and so on. And then there was one that started off as to be Dick Tracy. And I invited a group of young artists over who had started up a gallery, a cooperative gallery. And I wanted to be part of it. And they came and looked at these paintings, and there was absolute silence. Nobody said anything. So I knew I was doing the wrong thing, which was one of my great mistakes. I painted over most of those canvases and just saved this one. Anyway, we're back at the at Mr. Sitner's. I was still working on stuff for American Standard and studying art history. When it came time to do an MA thesis, I decided to concentrate on the Dada works done in New York by a couple of French artists, Francis Picabia and Marcel Duchamp. And I spent the next 3 years deciphering their works and making order out of it. I only took the decade, well, a little more than a decade. It went the works that they did from 1910 to about 1922. And I deciphered the works and I put it in the order, and I just had come up with the idea that they each concentrated on the life of a young lady, and each painting was about an aspect of her life, through being a teenager and flirting, to getting married, and in this case, having a baby. It's called the infant carburetor. But I picked on them because, you know, the close similarity between, they were using they got all these shapes from catalogs, which had been done just by somebody like me. So I related directly to it, but they were using these shapes for storytelling. This is a reproduction of Duchamp's major work, which everything he had painted during the previous decade ended up represented in this big painting on glass, which fell down and broke at the Brooklyn Museum around 1921. And then he spent the next 10 years pasting it all back together. But it's all about the life of a young lady who's being supported by a group of, well, there's a clergyman, there's a delivery boy from a department store, there's somebody who sells flowers, all that sort of thing. And they try to get their message of love to her. She's up above there, hanging from what he called a cloud. And just as she gets their message, she faints and remains a virgin. It's called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even. And I was the first to decipher it. But he also did stuff like this, which was extraordinarily elegant. He also, earlier on, one of his early works was The Nude Descending the Staircase, which made such a sensation at the Armory Show in 1913 in New York. Picabia, by the way, was the only major European artist who came from Europe to that show. And apparently, and he gave out a lot of statements about what modern art was all about. And those all got published and became the basis of teaching what art is about, modern art is about, in the United States. Anyway, this was Duchamp's painting from that show called The Nude Descending the Staircase. And in looking for the origins of the symbolism and the image, I came across an exact diagram that Duchamp had used by a photographer named Mare. This is a different photograph by Mare. All those images, 50 images, well, 50 images a second, but they're all on a single plate. And then I found out that Mare, in turn, was influenced by Edgar Muybridge, who was in New York, and that they had corresponded, and that Muybridge had gone to Paris and had given demonstrations of his photographs and found a way of projecting them. Anyway, in the change, this was the basis of a the upheaval of modern art. It changed the way people thought, philosophy and art. And it's the end of the Renaissance, which was all about a fixed point of view and everything remaining stationary. Now everything became centered on the idea of motion. The Italian futurists, the French cubists, everything was about motion, forms in motion. Nothing remains stable. But it's such a radical presentation of the human body that everything else immediately became old hat. Well, I ended the thesis when Picabia died. And I was asked to do an article which got published, I think in Arts magazine in 1953. And that was my entrance into the New York art world as a writer. But in my own work, I decided to forget about all that symbolism and all about modernism and so forth. And I was much more influenced by the work of people like Willem de Kooning and Philip Guston, Franz Klein, who were around me. And I got to know them somewhat. And I think the Statue of Liberty is under this painting. It became an expressionist landscape painting. And these paintings paintings like this, made up my first one-man show, which was held at a co-op gallery. And just a few months after the article on Picabia came out, it must have been sometime in 1954. And then I went on to make a whole series of watercolors from rocks, and then would make oil paintings from the rocks. It was kind of a misuse of abstract expressionist techniques as a kind of impressionism, but I was very excited about it. And in 1958, I received a Fulbright Fellowship to Italy, to go back to Italy. And I did a series of drawings of the Roman ruins and did expressionist paintings from those drawings, which is what this painting is about. While I was in Italy, I got hired to teach at Pratt Institute, and that ended my career as in the field of graphic design. At Pratt, one of the members of the faculty, Mercedes Matter, started a sketch group, and she invited a group of us to her studio every Sunday night. And it included a couple well-known artists like Philip Guston, Jack Tworkoff, and then some younger members of the faculty like myself. And this was one of the first painting, this I think was the first painting I tried to do from drawings I did in that sketch group. Then I wrote an article. Because I was a member of that sketch group, the editor of Art News magazine asked me if I would be interested in reviewing a show that the Museum of Modern Art had just was about to put on, which followed their really radical show called New Images of Man, which was organized, I think, sometime around 1959 or 60, and from which Willem de Kooning emerged, as one of the leading stars, and now I can't think of his name. Giacometti was the big superstar to come out of that show. And most of the artists at the time referred to that show as the Buchenwald image of man. But all the figures were so tortured and twisted and mangled. So the museum, I guess, was responding to that criticism, and they were putting on a big show of figurative painting by anybody who wanted to submit, who was doing figurative work. So I was interested in seeing the show, and I went to their storeroom, where all the rejected work was lined up on one side of the room and the accepted work was on the other side. The accepted work all looked like from the previous show, the new image of man, and everything that was that approached real naturalistic representational painting had been rejected. And so instead of writing a review of the show, I began with a question, how come the sophisticated audience, in whatever the year was, 1959 or 60, why couldn't the sophisticated audience accept a naturalistic representational painting? And conversely, why did artists making such naturalistic paintings couldn't make a painting that was acceptable to this group? And I listed the number of problems I thought were involved, including the idea that from Muybridge that everything is now seen in motion and fragmentary, and fragmentation had become the normal way of trying to depict everything in art. Anyway, the whole 20th century mainstream had been in terms of fragmentation in motion, including abstract expressionist painting, which is all about the motion of the brush across the surface. Anyway, and I posed a series of possible solutions. And at the end of writing the article, which took a couple of months, I was convinced that I had to hire models and work directly from observation. And this was one of the first paintings I did, working directly from life. And in my own studio, which was fairly small, I had the lights fixed overhead, because back in those days the paintings were done directly on the wall. You didn't even bother with an easel. You tacked the canvas up to the wall and the lights were directly overhead. So I had the model stand there and I got an easel. But the play of lights was radical for me. I'd never seen a model under direct artificial light before from different sources, and I became intrigued with the play of shadows that developed. Anyway, pretty soon I evolved onto these larger scale compositions. The painting is 6 feet wide. And everything was done directly from life, including painting the blanket and all that. Because as soon as the models are gone, the blanket looks different. It doesn't stay in its place. Anyway, about 20 years later, or 30 years later, I was asked by one of my former fellow students at the NYU Institute of Fine Arts in Art History if I would do a painting of one of our old professors, Erwin Panofsky, for the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, which had been set up for Albert Einstein and Erwin Panofsky. They had been considered as equals. And this was going to be a big celebration of Panofsky's centennial, the centennial of his birth. And they were going to have a series of seminars and speakers and so forth in a publication. And trying to remember the name of my old friend. Erwin is his first name. At any rate, he said, and we'd like you to do the portrait since you studied with Panofsky. And I said, but I don't work from photographs, and Panofsky did. And Erwin said, well, it's time you started working from photographs. And so he sent me a series of photographs, and I picked one that had been taken by flash, with a small flash camera, of one of his grandchildren. I was surprised at how few photographs actually existed and how rare photographs were at this earlier time. Now they're so common. But there were only about 4 or 5 other photographs of Panofsky, and they were all very formal and make him look like he's, you know, like that Winston photograph of Winston, the Winston photograph of Churchill, where Churchill was smoking and looking like the ruler of the world. So in this one, at least he looked human. But the hand was very fuzzy. Anyway, I made a slide of the photograph and projected it onto a sheet of mylar and hung it in front of me so that it would be more or less as a person sitting there the same distance from me as if you were in the room. But the hand was too fuzzy, and so I cheated and I used my own hand in the mirror. We were about the same age at that point. But while I worked on it, I realized that all the time I was working with the figure and I'd begun adding objects, that I was really, in a sense, refuting Panofsky, whose ideas dominated the Institute of Fine Art, which was that a civilization could be interpreted by the art it produced, or conversely, through the art it produced, you could study the civilization. And he used as his major demonstration a print of Dürer's called Melancholia, of a woman sitting there with a bunch of instruments representing different sciences around her. And I decided, since I had taken all that time to understand the iconography of Duchamp and Picabia, I didn't want to bother. I rejected all that. Didn't want to bother with it. Nobody's going to worry about the iconography of my paintings, except some graduate student, maybe sometime in the future. So I decided maybe I was just setting up puzzles for that future graduate student. Incidentally, the model in the foreground referred to my early painting of the carousel. When she looked at this composition, it said, like, you've gone back to the merry-go-round. And she was right. That these are all objects I have collected. And I know it looks like it should mean something, but I don't know what the meaning is. Except another artist at the time was doing lots of paintings of horses that somehow became a symbol of feminism. That's a wooden swan, a decoy. And of course, you can't escape a reference to Da Vinci's painting of Leda and the Swan, which he got from classical antiquities. I had a show in Paris, probably about 15 years ago now. And I got this very nice write-up in one of the big Parisian art magazines with these 2 reproductions, including this painting at the bottom, the two female nude models surrounded by 5 wooden bird decoys. But in the same issue, my old friend Picabia showed up. Picabia, it seems, at the end of his life, painted a whole series of naked ladies or semi-naked ladies from softcore porn magazines. Again, I think it was part of the old Dada shock the bourgeoisie attitude. But there they are. And of course, they weren't known. They had never been exhibited publicly during his lifetime and were undocumented. And then later, years later, after his death, they were taken out of the warehouse and became very popular and famous. And now he's only known for these paintings of the nude. And there was this big article on him with about 10 reproductions of his paintings, including this one. And the dealer I was showing with in Paris was also dealing in Picabia nudes. So suddenly, he's back in my life as a competitor. It turns out that Marcel Duchamp also ended up as a realist. This is the installation he did at the Philadelphia Museum, which accepted the work as a gift without knowing it, without knowing what they were getting. And apparently, at the public presentation, the trustees were so embarrassed that they forbade any photographs to be taken. And no photographs of it were reproduced until about 10 years ago, when suddenly this appeared in one of the art magazines. You see it at the end of the Philadelphia Museum, on the ground floor. You have to walk all the way to the back, and there's a big barn door with a knothole, which is over my head. I have to keep jumping up to the... And what you see is this, you look right into the crotch of the young woman, 3-dimensionally realized, and she's lying on a bank of grass, and she holds that little fluorescent light in her head. Well, this was a much more recent painting of mine, with all the, I guess, my love of gadgets and industrial shapes are there. Well, I want to give a quick review of my experience as a printmaker. My first experience, as I said, was in the Army, and then later I did years of making color overlays, color separations for Mr. Suttner's office. And so going into printmaking was kind of a natural activity. It started, again, when I was teaching at Pratt. The head of the print shop there asked anyone on the faculty who was interested to do a print. And this was one of the first ones I did. It's a lithograph done from a wash drawing I had done of a cliff along the Amalfi Coast in Italy. And somebody actually bought out the edition because of the color, which was the wrong color. I had asked for a kind of a raw sienna, and this was printed in burnt sienna, and the whole edition was printed this way before I had a chance to protest. But somebody bought the edition to use the print in his hotel decoration because they liked the color. These were done in touche. This was my first attempt at doing a figure. Touche is a wash, it allows you to do a wash technique. It's still with the grease dissolved in water. Then I thought it was much easier just to draw, and this was drawn on a zinc plate. It was the first large-scale print I tried. And then sort of was invited down by a fellow who had been a student at Pratt Institute, and this was about 10 years later. He started up a printing press that became very, very successful in the following years at the University of South Florida. His name was Donald Saff, and responsible for artists like not Jasper Jones, Rauschenberg, but somebody else.
James Rosenquist.
Thank you. James Rosenquist, that sort of thing. But I was the first one he had invited down, and I did a series of drawings on stones with all of the students standing around. And at that point, they didn't know whether in Florida it was legal or not to use naked models in the studio. Nobody had done it. And so there was this sense of adventure on the part of the students and on the part of the models, who were also students. By the way, shortly after this, I had my first museum show was actually a show of prints, drawings, and watercolors in Berlin, in West Berlin. And this image was printed as the poster for the show. And I'm sure it had tremendous influence in Germany, especially on the part of one artist who proceeded to do a whole series of paintings of nudes sitting on chairs upside down. I think he came across my poster lying on the floor upside down. Again, I returned to touche to see what the results would be. And this was the first multicolored print, ambitious one that I tried. Then I got involved in aquatint etching, mostly because one of my models had a degree in printmaking. And she knew all about aquatint etching, and she did all the technical work on this. This was done in 2 colors. It's called Silver Bench. The bench actually has silver ink on it. Well, this one is about 30-some inches wide. There are prints on exhibition over in the other building.
Yeah.
So you'll get to see the size of them there. This is the watercolor that I did on a trip out to Arizona, where I was cultural exchange person to the Navajo. I don't know who they sent here. But I did a number of things out there. I went over a period of a couple of summers. This is in Monument Valley, and did a print. And again, you'll see all the print, the proofs, the stages that it went through over in the other building. But this is the way I decided to work from the watercolor, by looking at the watercolor in the mirror to get the reverse image, which I then redeveloped on the copper plate. The copper plate was exactly the same size as the watercolor. But I worked from the watercolor as if it were the actual landscape. This shows the one of the bites, one of the stages where you put lacquer over all the areas that you don't want to be bitten, and then the copper plate is put in the acid bath for a certain number of seconds or minutes, depending on the degree of darkness you wanted to print in. The aquatint is actually a kind of ground up rosin, varnish rosin, which is put on as a very fine dust over the plate, and then the plate is heated so that the rosin particles adhere to it, and that acts almost as the same idea as the half-tone printing technique used by newspapers. It breaks the image down into dots, and it's the fragments of the dots that get printed. The acid beats around them, producing little islands that hold the ink. This is another part of the process. I wanted to get all the little linear elements in some sort of sharp, clearly defined way. That's done with sugar lift, in which you actually paint with sugar water with a little bit of ink in it so that you can see it. And you paint directly on the copper. And then the copper is coated with a very thin layer of lacquer. And then it's immersed in water, and the sugar, somehow the water gets through the lacquer and makes the sugar expand, and it breaks through the surface of the lacquer. So that when after you wash it and dry it off, you put it in the acid, and the acid goes through where all those little lines were, through the lacquer surface. This is the final print. You work blindly, you don't know what you're doing, and you don't see the results until you get a proof. Well, the original watercolors were all done directly on site, and here I am on the edge of a canyon with the easel tied to the tree. Because out there, winds are terrific, and they come in on schedule. I was warned about it. And at one place where I worked, I was even tied to the tree. When the wind comes in, it's like a locomotive rushing in past you. It comes in at 2:30 in the afternoon, something like that, on schedule. Well, this was looking down into the Canyon de Chelly, and on the opposite side, there are these ruins, ancient Indian ruins from the 10th, 11th, or 12th centuries, built into the caves. The cave itself struck me as looking like part of the head of Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster, because of those streaks, those mineral streaks coming down. And I later did an aquatint etching for that. And then later, another one from another watercolor that I did at the time. Made a trip to Egypt and did this watercolor on the site of the Temple of Hatshepsut, working very early in the morning before the tourists came. Managed to complete it and later developed this aquatint etching from the watercolor. And watercolor of the Sphinx, which I took as a serious portrait of a famous person, one of the pharaohs. And this is the resulting etching. However, this was the final proof. We were going to go ahead and in order to make an addition, the copper plate has to be steel-faced so that all those little marks don't wear away too rapidly. And when it came back from the steel facer, it printed like this. He had overdone it. And it couldn't be reversed electronically. And so I did it over again. And the Brooklyn Museum actually put on a show. There was a total of 22 or 23 proofs done from the 2 times around. They put that show on. So sometimes you run into real disastrous troubles. This was a large drawing directly on stone done at the Tamarind Institute, also in Arizona. Or is it New Mexico? Somewhere around there. And this full-color proof. It's a funny thing about the images. People get offended for some reason or other by the way I do certain parts of the body. In this case, there were strong objections I heard from one woman art dealer to that hip bone, and she wouldn't handle the print. This is the first line proof of a larger print. The proofs are over on exhibition here. I did a view of New York City first as a watercolor. This was the original line drawing on the watercolor before I started putting the color on. And because I had taken this slide, I could transfer by tracing onto copper plate.